Welcome, friends. I'm glad you have joined me again this week as we take a closer look at some of the questions we find in Scripture. If you have a Bible nearby, we will be looking at Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41, if you would like to follow along as I read in a few moments. I did not count them myself, but I recently read that Jesus is asked questions by other people 183 times in Scripture. Interestingly, he only answers a couple of those questions directly. In some instances, Jesus responds to a question with silence, as when Pilate questioned him after his arrest. Sometimes Jesus responds to a question indirectly, such as when he is asked, "Who is my neighbor?" and he responds by telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. Most often, though, Jesus responds to a question with another question. When asked, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" Jesus responds, "Why are you putting me to the test?" And then pointing to a coin, Jesus asks, "Whose head is this and whose title?" Sometimes the questions are genuine questions, and Jesus waits for an answer. Sometimes the questions are rhetorical, meant to be left unanswered, at least in that moment. Again, I did not count them myself, but apparently Jesus asks 307 questions in the Gospels. He has asked 183 questions, and he asks 307. If you have some time this week, or it may take a little longer than a week, maybe you can start to keep a list as you read through the Gospels. All these questions make me wonder why we have paid so little attention to the Jesus who asks questions, and instead have focused so intently on the answers we assume or want him to give. Richard Rohr suggests that it is because answers give us more a feeling of success and closure. Easy answers instead of hard questions allow us to try to change others instead of allowing God to change us. In the foreword of a book by another author, Rohr writes, "Jesus asks questions, good questions, unnerving questions, realigning questions, transforming questions. He leads us into liminal and therefore transformative space, much more than taking us into any moral high ground of immediate certitude or ego superiority. He subverts up front the cultural or theological assumptions that we are eventually going to have to face anyway. He leaves us betwixt and between where God and grace can get at us and where we are not at all in control." I love that. The questions are where God and grace can get at us and where we are not at all in control. Challenging and hopeful words. Jesus' questions are not so much a matter of the head or mind, but a matter of the heart. They lead us to the unknown, not to stay there forever, but they lead us to a place of uncertainty just long enough to help us move to a more faithful place. This is the work of spiritual formation. Jesus forms us, shapes us, and even repositions us, sometimes through his stories and teachings, sometimes through our attempts to follow him, and sometimes through the questions he asks of others and of us. Today's story and today's question can be found in Mark 4:35 through 41. It's the story of Jesus calming the storm. Hear now these words from Mark. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" In this story, the disciples are in a place of uncertainty and fear on a boat in the middle of the sea when a strong storm comes up. Jesus is asleep, taking time for a much-needed rest after all of the teaching and healing he has been doing around Galilee. None of the commotion disturbs Jesus, but the disciples are panicking. They are in the middle of the sea and their boat is taking on water. So they wake Jesus up. "Do you not care that we are perishing? Do you not care that we are about to die?" Have you ever been in a situation when you were really worried or anxious or even angry about something and the people around you were calm and not taking your concern seriously? This is how I imagine the disciples felt. They are in danger, and the one person who might be able to do something about it is asleep, seemingly unaware of it all. This passage of scripture actually contains multiple questions, but the one I want us to focus on is the one that comes after Jesus wakes up. He wakes up, rebukes the wind, and says to the sea, "Peace, be still." The wind ceased, and we are told that there was a dead calm. Just like that, Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" If there is one thing that most, if not all of us, have experience with, it is fear, being afraid. In his book, The Questions of Jesus, John Deere quotes Henry Nouwen saying, "Fear is the opposite of love." And Deere adds that this is because when we are afraid, we put up our defenses, strike out at one another, and fail to love. I know that when I am anxious and afraid, I have a really hard time trusting other people. Fear paralyzes us. And I don't think the issue in this story is really that the disciples were afraid. Their fear of the storm is understandable and justified. It's that they allowed their fear to overtake them in an instant. They don't turn to Jesus and ask him for help. They wake him up assuming the worst. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" It's not so much a faithful request as it is a fear-induced accusation. Why are we having to ask? Why aren't you already doing something about this? And if we're honest with ourselves, we also carry around a lot of fear. We seem to be afraid of life and death, of failure, of success. We're afraid of one another and afraid of being alone. I imagine we may have been introduced to some new fears in recent days, things we didn't even know to be fearful of a couple of months ago. A certain amount of fear and caution may help keep us safe. Too much fear, though, will isolate us from others and maybe even isolate us from our own true selves. Walking the journey of faith, following Jesus, will not make all of our fears immediately vanish or magically go away. But I wonder if we might consider this week what fears we have given too much power to. Do you have a fear in your life that paralyzes you? Do you have a fear in your life that causes you to put up your defenses and fail to love? Do you have a fear that keeps you from being the person you want to be or the person you feel called by God to be? Perhaps you could take a few moments to think about fear this week and the parts of your life that need to hear the words, peace, be still. I imagine many of us feel our lives have been tossed by a storm recently. Some may feel that we are even perishing. So maybe you could say those words out loud to yourself. Peace, be still. It may feel awkward at first, but those words, peace, be still, may be the very words our soul is longing to hear as we go about this week. Maybe Jesus' words will become our words too. Take good care, and may you find the courage to say, peace, be still, this week.